Good evening. Um, Let me just see here. I have none of my webinar participants as yet. I hope they all didn't check themselves into the hospital. But anyway, um, because I have no webinar participants here, let me invite you to participate in the webinar if you wish to. And this is the link to the webinar in case you wish to join us. So this what this means though is your voice will be heard and your image will be recorded if you join our webinar. Um, so anything you say will be public, quite public. And I hope if you don't mind that, you're welcome to join the webinar and chat with us face to face. But if not, then allow me to go through. I'll certainly answer any questions you have. Tonight, we're going to talk about 3 chapters of Memories, Dreams, Reflections. We agreed we would talk about Memories, Dreams, Reflections tonight. And so this is it. But before I do that, I should mention again, for anyone who doesn't know, that the Eranos conference, which was scheduled for about 6 weeks from now in Ascona, Switzerland, but just north of Milan, Italy, has been canceled. Or actually, it's not been canceled, but it has been postponed for 1 year. So it will be conducted from the 22nd of April to the 25th of April of 2021. And, but there's going to be no Eranos conference in this spring. There is one on a different topic in the fall, and you can refer to the Eranos Foundation for that information. So we have a few people joining us. And so if you have questions or comments as we go along, or you want to talk about anything in terms of current events, I'm happy to talk about those things too. But we are, oh, there we have, hi, Nancy has come. Hello, Nancy. Welcome. It's nice to have company here. Yeah, I don't hear you though. Let me unmute you.
There we go.
Yeah, okay.
So it's just the two of us at the moment.
Yes, it's just the two of us. And since you were the one that instigated this Memories, Dreams, Reflections discussion, what questions or comments do you have, or on anything?
Well, I have several.
Okay.
I have several on
Good.
the chapter on travels. Okay. And to start with page 245.
Okay. Let me get my camera squared away here. Okay. Hi, Nicholas. Nice to see you tonight. Okay. So page what? 245?
Page 245.
Okay. I actually have 2 markers in that page, so it must be important.
Well, I wonder if it's the same thing I have. What kind of startled me, and I may have read about this before and just forgotten, was that Jung is talking about a dream of his, and that in the dream there's an Arab of dusky complexion.
Yes.
And Jung says this marks this Arab figure as a shadow, but not the personal shadow, rather an ethnic one. And so talking about the shadow of the self versus the personal shadow, I'm unclear on those differences.
All right. I think what he's talking about is a cultural shadow, which is, of course, we have our embarrassments in terms of how we've dealt with different nationalities and ethnic groups in the United States. And in a sense, they're all our shadow. And so I was thinking about one um, just before we came online, because right here on my button on my shirt here, right at this white button, I had a little stretch of thread coming out from the button, and I wanted to get rid of it because Marines are taught to uh, clip these things off. But when I was on active duty 50 years ago, uh, and actually 53 years ago when I was in OCS, what we were taught to call that piece of thread was that it was an Irish pennant. And of course, the what's behind that term is that when the Irish came in to the UK or the US uh, after the potato famine, and for many years thereafter, they were very often poor, and so they often were threadbare. In other words, they had threads off their clothing, and and so it got this name of an Irish pennant for if you had stuff. Well, I don't know who started it, but I know the Marines were using that term, and so I said, "Oh man, I have to cut this Irish pennant off of here." but but our bad treatment of the Irish is, of course, a shadow of for at that time at least is a shadow for Americans. And I don't have to get into all the other examples, but we have plenty of them in the US of shadows that we have because we haven't treated various religions, various ethnic groups, what have you. I mean, my grandfather was the most bigoted man I ever heard, and he had a name for every ethnic group. and he and I were like oil and water. I mean, I just I couldn't get along with him, and but you know what the hell, he gave me life, so I have to respect him for that.
That's
Uh,
right.
and he was the one who uh, in the Spanish flu of 1918. We're having this conversation because of the Spanish flu, because in 1918, my grandfather was engaged to a woman who, together with her four sisters, all died on the same weekend from the Spanish flu. And as a result of that, he married my grandmother. And so I can exist, and this conversation can exist. And so I'm very serious about what's happening now, for example. And I announced in my meditation group this noontime that I won't be coming back because I have 5 psychologists in my meditation group, but I won't be coming back to the physical meeting with them until after we have a vaccine for coronavirus, um, because I'm in as you are. We're both in the risk group. Maybe I'm
Right.
a little bit more than you because I have had asthma all my life, a little mild form of it. I have 13% asthma is what my allergist says, but so it's not that bad, but you can hear it in my gravelly voice and the fact that I'm often clearing my throat. And um,
Well, I know what you're saying about the coronavirus because we have some in Reno.
uh-huh.
And my daughter was performing in an improv group the other night, and whether to go or not was really a big decision.
Yeah.
And
Well, I think very soon you're going to have exactly what's going on in Italy right now, because in Italy they had triple the number of cases since last Wednesday, from about 2,100 to 6,300 this morning.
In how little time?
in 5 days.
Oh my goodness.
And so the Prime Minister of Italy has now locked down all of Italy as of today. And basically that's what we have to do if we're going to save a lot of people. Otherwise we're going to overwhelm the health system because people don't realize it, but if it doubles every 6 days, which is what I was seeing, it means the health system is overmaxed on May 2nd.
Mm.
And so that's quite frightening. And anyway, we'll see. And Ron Fun says, Jung seemed weak on life after death in his essay on the matter. He could have gained that level of knowledge had he received a spiritual transmission from Ramana Maharishi and not ran away from him. So, Ron, you're welcome to give us your view on life after death, and I'll try to include it here on the broadcast, or I put the link to our panel up above, so you could also join us verbally, and so you're welcome to do that. I'm not going to take a hard position on life after death, but we'll talk about that. Unless you want to talk about that first, but you wanted to talk about the travel. So
right.
So the
yes.
question was about this.
The shadow
dark,
of the self versus the personal shadow.
So, well, I think the shadow of the self is the personal shadow. So that's one and the same thing. But I think what he was talking about was a European perspective on dark colored people from Africa, basically. And in that case, it was probably an Arab that he was talking about.
Yes, that's right.
And not a truly black African.
Right. So the next one I have is on page 250.
Okay. Okay.
About a little below the middle of the page, Jung writes, he's referring to, let me see what group, the Pueblo Indians.
Mm-hmm.
And he says their religious conceptions are not theories to them, which indeed would have to be very curious theories to evoke tears from a man, but facts, not religious conceptions, but facts as important and moving as the corresponding external realities. And that's what we're missing, I think, today. One of the things we're missing today in the Christian faith is that they're no longer facts that are believable. So the numinosity of what used to be in the Middle Ages, very powerful and would have brought tears to people's eyes,
Surely.
no longer does today.
Right. Well, that's true. And the question is, what does bring tears to your eyes? What brings emotion? How do you find that? And the clear answer here is that you find it inwardly. And I think, as I read more and more about Eranos, for example, the ancients were always looking inward. Okay, they knew that heaven, all these goddesses, things and such, all of those were internal. They're not, you weren't expecting, Zeus to walk in your door necessarily, unless you're in a myth like Philemon and Bacchus. And so, the ancients did understand that these things were inward, but what happened over 2,000 years is the church basically cut off all the internal experience. Okay. And the guys that were talking about experience were the Gnostics, and the church said, "Oh, don't pay attention to that. That's not good," you know. And so they basically made people turn away from the numinous until the point where there's no numinosity anymore. Like, you know, what there is unconscious numinosity, I think. I mean, in ritual, we have, you know, as Dr. Jung pointed out, rituals can be very, you know, touch you very deeply. And you know, I do have parts of various rituals that affect me very deeply. Um, and I'm a very logical guy, but you know, I almost cannot even talk about the Navy hymn as an example without getting emotional about it because I have so much skin in the game, and everybody that I grew up with had a lot of skin in the game too. So, um, you know, I remember the first time that I heard the hymn, and it was at the Naval Air Station Chapel in Norfolk, Virginia. And everybody sang that hymn, you know, extremely vociferously and with much emotion because everybody had skin in the game at that time. I mean, at that time, which was the mid 50s, that airport, the Naval Air Station in Norfolk, was the busiest airport in the world before O'Hare became the busiest airport in the world. The one at the Naval Air Station was, and what they were doing was they were looking for Russian submarines during the Cold War, and so they were flying all these anti-submarine warfare missions, 12-hour missions out and back. And, you know, there were guys dying out there. I mean, I remember a number of crews that were lost, not because of battle, but just because when you're running airplanes up and down the coast, sometimes they fall out of the sky type thing, you know. And so,
Oh, Skip,
yeah.
Art is trying to get into the chat room but can't. Is there
Okay.
anything you can
Yep,
tell him?
I can fix that. Just a minute. Just a minute. Art, let me allow you in. Allow to talk and promote the panelist. There, Art, you should be in now. And hopefully. And right, thanks for pointing that out to me, Nancy. And so it seems to me that we have to understand Christianity in a different way than the way it's been taught, because it's very hard to, you know, for rationalists, people who are way up here in the ego. And let's see. All right, I'm going to mute you until you're ready to talk, okay? Because we're hearing your voice or your breath and so on. But if you want to talk, you know, you can either unmute yourself or just let me know and we'll put you on. So anyway, what was I saying? So, you know, Christianity has been sold to young people, you know, from kindergarten on up, from Bible school on up, as magical thinking. And we still see a lot of magical thinking in our society today. And, people who are rationalists can't buy that. But, I'm a rationalist. And for a long while, religion was anathema to me, very honestly, because um, when my daughter attacked me with the statement that I was going to hell, and I was so angry about that. I mean, I had this vision, but I wasn't thinking about this at the time. Um, but I had this vision of the devil dropping into my car, and I was furious about that. And I was seeing, you know, fundamental religion as kind of the enemy. But then I realized that, oh, by the way, that is a demonstration of the fact that everything about religion is psychological. It's not physical in the world. It's and then Dr. Jung said that explicitly in paragraph 752 of Answer to Job, that every religious statement is a statement of the psyche. And I read that and I go, oh, yeah, that's it. But I had never thought about that before. And, I had to get to be, I don't know, in my 60s before that penny finally dropped. And, um, and then I could come back and look at the ritual and the lessons and books like this, which is Edinger's The Bible and the Psyche, okay, which is talking about religion from a psychological point of view. And we were having this conversation with Miles earlier today. I think you were in that email exchange where, um, Paul Vanderklay and these three pastors were talking about Jordan Peterson. And I think, Paul Vanderklay seems to understand that the physical stories that the pastor is telling have to do with the divine drama that goes on in everyone's psyche. And it's not that we all have a Christian psyche, it's that we all have to have transformation. And what the religions have always done is provided a way for uh, people to transform their psyche over their lifetime. That's one of the main functions that they provide. They provide comfort and they provide um, these transformational stories. And when you think of it in that way, then you say, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And oh, by the way, you get a community out of it, you get friends out of it, you meet mates that way that are sensible people, and you're not flailing all over the place, not connected with anything. And so um, so I now understand why the religious um, community is so important to people. I just think it's taught very, very badly right now, and and uh, and it needs to be corrected now. And as I say, in fairness to Paul, I'm not saying that about him because um, I think he has always been a pastor who could do his pastoring, in the sense that Dr. Jung said that, the great religions are grand schemes of psychotherapy. And I think that, Paul had embodied that long before I ever ran into him on internet, or long before he ever heard about uh, Jordan Peterson. And so, what did Jordan Peterson do for him? Well, he was trying to understand why people were coming back to the church because of Jordan Peterson. But uh, the point was, which Jung had pointed out a century before, that if you understand something, it'll make and it makes more sense to you, um, then you might embody it yourself. So, a lot of young engineering science graduates and so on that we have today, all these logical kids that we've developed, rational kids, um, they never understood their religion. But now, because of Jordan Peterson's Bible lectures, now he's connected them up with the Bible in a way that maybe St. Thomas did that, you know, back in the fourth century, and other theologians over the years who wrote and spoke all through the years. And so the theologians were always connecting people up to the mystery of the divine drama that's going on in everybody's psyche. And and I mean in Hindu psyches too, and in Buddhist psyches too, in all psyches. Um, and so the magic that Jordan Peterson did, which Paul didn't really understand at the beginning, he's saying, why would people go hear this psychology professor talk about the Bible? And what he was doing was connecting people up with the Bible and showing them how it really works in the psyche. So, that's all well and good, and there's no reason to dispute that. The problem is that it's still one-sided. It's still on the logos, on the rational side. Jerome, welcome. I'm sorry I didn't say hello to you earlier.
Well, that's all right. I was running a little late today.
Mhm.
Anyway, yeah, I watched the Paul Vanderklay thing that you were talking about uh, with different people today. But I also watched a Paul Vanderklay video where Paul talked about intuition,
Uh-huh.
and he does not trust intuition. So that, in terms of Myers-Briggs, that's called a bias. He's a very extroverted out person,
Yeah.
and he's very sensing,
Yeah.
okay, and a feeling type,
Right.
I would think.
Right.
And the bias that extroverts have towards introverts is they don't trust the intuitive or the introverted function at all. So there's a bias there. Likewise, some of us that are maybe introverted and intuitive uh, may not trust the extroverted sensing types. Okay,
Yeah.
so you're getting a play here between the two types, and I
Yeah.
think that's part of our communication. As Paul says, well, intuitive types can be wrong,
Well, yeah, and so can
and that's
sensing
true,
types.
and that's true.
Yeah.
We can be wrong.
Right.
However, sensing types can be wrong also. Just think of all the scientific discoveries and things that they thought was true and is not true. And they keep
Right.
proving it over and over. So
Right.
each side has not true, you know.
Right.
So the ideal thing is to get together with both and develop both of these functions, or at least
Mhm.
talk to people where we understand that those are the differences.
Right. So, Nancy, did we address your issue though? That's the question.
Let's see. We were talking about the fact that to the Pueblo Indians, their religion and what they believed were facts to them that had a numinous quality.
Right, and they were keeping them secret, and and they, well, Jung talked at length about the importance of a secret, and how it would be a binder for a group. And so it is a binder, for example, for the Masons or any group like that, uh, Amaranth or whatever group you can think of. And it's a binder because, you know, it's, you know, if you keep a secret, then people know you're loyal to them. But if you don't keep a secret, then you're not loyal. And so the Indians and, you know, Mountain Lake, who's the name, which is the name, the Indian name, or Ochiawabe or something like that, Ochibano, whose name it translates to Mountain Lake anyway. He was this Indian chief that Dr. Jung met, and um, you know, Dr. Jung recognized that he had a more primitive perspective than Christians have about the world. But he said he was a bit envious of him because he had meaning in his life, and so Mountain Lake had this belief that if they stopped seeing the sun across the sky, um, as they do. Oh, there's Miles here. Promote to panelist. Miles is, you're in, Miles, hopefully. And hopefully Art is back too. Okay, so Miles, you're here at the exact right time because we're talking about Mountain Lake, but let me just finish what I was saying. So he felt that Mountain Lake had meaning in his life because he said that, you know, if they didn't see the sun across the sky in the way that they always had done, that the sun would fall out of the sky, basically, or something to that effect within 10 years. And so, you know, that's giving that person's life a meaning.
I wanted to mention something. I studied the Australian Aborigines at one time.
Uh-huh.
And what gave them real meaning was amazing to me. For instance, let's say a woman felt the baby move within her for the first time, and she happened to be by a certain well associated with a certain ancestor, then that child automatically became that particular ancestor, would have that particular role. His whole life was mapped out for him from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Sure. You know, I'm sure there's been a lot of that. And
Well, I think they were in contact with what we're missing in terms of their messages that came through. They were all soul connected, and it's, even though that level was primitive, it's still a level that we should aspire to, I would think, in terms
yeah.
of reflecting and getting back to our roots.
Yes.
And I
And
think that's what Jung saw. And if you read, kind of summarize this, you know, he felt that he was missing something by meeting these people. He said, something in me is missing. And that's the effect they had on him.
mm-hmm.
And if you go out into the world, and you've been out in the world, and I have, and you meet different people and different cultures and different beliefs and different rituals, it has an effect on you, because you say, there's something about that that's in me, but it's missing. And I think that's
Yeah.
what Jung was doing there.
Right. And, you know, when you live among people who are a different cultural background, it changes you. It surely does. But let me just refer back to these chats for a minute. Ron Fun was asking about, he had assumed that I was familiar with this event during Jung's India trip where Ramana Maharishi, Jung refused to meet him. And he says, but it could have taken him to new levels and amounted to a union of East and West. And I do agree with that. And I think that that was a mistake by Dr. Jung not to meet with him. Uh, he had a lot going on right then at the time that he refused to meet with him. And at the time, he was rather concerned about the mixing of cultures, I think. I mean, he talked in part in this chapter about going black, so called, where you know, Westerners who went into Africa, into Kenya or whatever, very shortly they would start to take on the mannerisms of the Africans. And, certainly when I lived in Japan for 8 years, 3 years in high school and 5 years, 16 years later, and both times, um, you find yourself bowing into the telephone, literally. You're on the telephone and you're bowing, even though you can't see in those days, we couldn't see the other person. But when you were in contact with a Japanese person, you'd bow to them. And everyone picked up this mannerism, even though even the young people who were living on the American base, which we called Little America, would still pick up this mannerism. And one of my friends once said, well, you've been in Japan too long when you start bowing into the telephone. But
yeah, the VTS group, anytime they're from South Korea, but anytime they'd give a presentation, they always do this, or they greet each other or leave.
right.
They always do the vow. So it's ingrained in that particular culture. So
Right.
the Ramana Maharishi incident, Jung said that when he was in India, that the people were too bright and they had too much light, too much sun. That was his comment, and he did not want to meet with Ramana because of that. And I think he was, there's different opinions on what Ramana was about, and that they said he is a manifestation of what's called the self, which would be
Sure, he was, yeah.
light being, and we don't know about the shadow. So Jung was also concerned about the shadow.
Right, and he was concerned about what might happen to him unconsciously.
Yeah, because bright lights will carry a big shadow behind it. So, and that was when he was talking about the answer to Job, and that he made the comment about the dark shadow behind bright light. So.
Right. And so, I think Jung was from a generation that hadn't really lived with globalization that much. I mean, he was sort of the leading edge of globalization in a way. I mean, all his travels to the United States, he was one of the very few that had the privilege to travel back and forth to the U.S., because in those days you had to do it by steamer. And, it's fairly unreliable steamers, because he came to the U.S. in 1909 and the Titanic went down in 1912. So those were different times, and he didn't have the internet. I mean, the way the world is changing today. I mean, I just saw it in, for example, India, where when I first started to work in India in the early 90s, the Indians had a special version of English, which we called Indlish, humorously, meaning it in a humorous way. And it was based on being ruled by the British for 250 years. But when but over the years now, over now 30 years that I've been interacting with India, nowadays most Indians who speak English speak with an American accent, and so they've taken on the American accent. and and so in a sense, what the internet has done is created the Americanization of the world, in a sense. um, and for better or for worse.
Then I want to say, I know the church is good, but you have to see the other side. Um, Sometimes religious people will keep people out. There be a lot of church hurt because if you a disabled person, gay, single, divorced, they keep you out of the church.
Yeah.
So I think for me,
Right.
I found God in my own way through college. I feel accepted for me being who I am, not trying to be something that other people want me to be, especially Christians.
Right.
You know,
So, Art, can you put your comments and questions into the chat, and
Yeah,
we'll be
oh,
careful.
that's right.
We'll
yeah,
we'll
he,
be we'll be careful to watch for your comments and questions, because right now we have 15 people watching, and I think some of these people might have a hard time understanding you.
yeah, he did.
That's
Yeah.
fine.
So
He did make a comment that he said,
right.
"What about abuse in the church?" So
Right, but could
I'll
you
watch.
add to your comment about abuse in the church? What kind of abuse are you talking about? Are you talking about abuse of the church? I mean, there's so many things that are there's so many abuses that have taken place around the church and around Black people one way or another. I'm not sure which ones you mean. So could you restate it, but restate it in on the chat so that one of us can read it for you, and that'll be better for our YouTube listeners. You know, I'm acknowledging to you that there is a lot of abuse in the church, and in many religious sects. I mean, you know, the more I see. I mean, my wife went totally to Buddhism 26 years ago, and for a long time, the teacher that she was following uh, was for her just like Christ to people in the Christian church. And then it turned out this guy was abusing some of the senior members of his flock. He ended up basically, he had a sect of 40,000 people around the world, and but he was being abusive to people, and ultimately the whole thing collapsed. And so there is a tendency, it seems to me, toward abuse whenever people gain power, and you know, that's the power devil. And you know, we see that in some of these televangelists, for example, who get power. They get an airplane, they get a Cadillac, and uh, their followers start to, you know, treat them like gods, and then they just get carried away and abuse people. And the question is, how do you teach leaders, church leaders or religious leaders, how to not do that? Um, and so Art saying, if you have a disability, that at the church people abuse you if you have a disability. I have no doubt that that's right. I mean, I hope you don't feel that I'm being abusive when I'm asking you to put your comments into the chat, because I want you to feel welcome here, certainly. And so, you know, people, I don't know that people are intentionally being abusive. They're just having maybe having a hard time following what you're saying, and they don't know how to um, interact with you in a reasonable way, possibly. Uh, you know, that could be a way of thinking about it. Um, and you know, I don't deny that there is abuse, and I know that handicapped people do um, experience abuse, but you know, I remember being in Japan at about age 40, and I met a couple of young Japanese girls, and they're saying back and forth to one another in Japanese, "Oh, he's an old man. Let's not pay any attention to him." Back when I was 40, long before I was an old man. But for them, they were maybe 20, so to them, I was an old guy.
I'll just interject. You were talking about power, and there's the word dominion is used in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, Canada, I believe, still is officially the Dominion of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And this word dominion is one that I think really needs to be explored, because a friend lent me a book by Joanna Macy called Act of Hope. And in this book by Joanna Macy, and there is another author, if I can maybe slip away, I'll go and get it. I forget who the other author is, but she talks about two kinds of power. There's power with, and then there's power over.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that gets to the crux of what the church needs to come to terms with. Is there dominion about power over, which to me is indicative of those church creeds that basically say, well, if you're not, towing our line, you're going to hell, like the Creed of Athanasius, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as opposed to dominion being power with.
Well, and that's the big issue that I still have with Paul Vanderklay, because if you go back and watch my interview with him, he made a distinction in that interview between the Reformed Church of America and the Reformed Church in America and the Christian Reformed Church. There's apparently two different sects of Reformed in America, and probably they're still different from Swiss Reformed, I suppose. But my point is that we have to get these religions to stop trying to tear each other apart and to turn back toward one another and find out what they have in common. And, if they can't keep their congregation when they're doing that, then they probably shouldn't be in business as a church, honestly.
Back in the 60s, Thomas Merton went to a meeting in Asia, which had contemplatives, monastics from many different religions and so forth. And they were talking about experience and finding that they could meet each other at the level of experience.
Well, and those meetings now happen regularly, probably in every major town in the United States, because I know that our pastors and priests in Annapolis, and I presume the rabbis too, do have a meeting, an ecumenical meeting once a month, but it's just them, and they don't involve their congregations. And, you know, I think they feel possessive in this, in a way, of their congregations, because their congregations mean their rice bowl, and so they don't allow their congregations to be exposed to the fact that they're talking with one another. Okay, so Art went on to say, being Black, disability, and gay at the time, they can't see God in people that are not like them. And yeah, Miles says, Art, that is too often true. And I think that that is true.
Well, and if I might add, you know, since we're looking at memories, dreams, and reflections, and the section on America, the travels chapter, America, the Pueblo Indians, that what Art has said is really how both in the United States and in Canada, it's been power over the Indigenous people, the Indians, as opposed to power with. And the Native Americans, the Indians, and I don't, you know, the Indian is an official word. What I would like to make people aware of every chance I get is apparently its root is not that, you know, Christopher Columbus was confused that he landed in India, but rather it comes from the Italian phrase ungenta in Dio. Ungenta, a people, in Dio, meaning in God. So, you know, somewhere back then, people recognized them as people in God, you know, or as they say, the creator. Now they're so very eros. We should learn from them. So, for example, let me share this little piece of poetry, the words of Chief Crowfoot, who was here, lived 100 years ago, and was a representative nearby where I live right now in Alberta, Canada. He represented the North Blackfoot and was a key participant in the signing of Treaty 7. And these are his words, quote, "What is life? It is the flash of a firefly in the night. It is the breath of the buffalo in the wintertime. It is the little shadow which runs across the grass and loses itself in the sunset." And that last statement, this little shadow which runs across the grass and loses itself in the sunset, that's so, well, the whole thing is so numinous, isn't it?
Yeah, sure.
And you just can't help but think that the little shadow running across the grass losing itself in the sunset is the Holy Spirit, you know, or something. Yeah, something like that potentially.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that. Marcus says, my sister prohibits me from showing her daughter books of Jung or discussing the psyche due to it conflicts with their church teachings. And, you know, I think that that's very common. I mean, in that video that we were looking at today with Paul Vanderklay was saying that when he was studying theology, they created a red flag around Jung. And, you know, what they did was they cut themselves off from the experience of God. You know, oh my gosh. And I think it's because, you know, the church has been hidebound for, you know, over 1,000 years, and you know, started to get that way in 325 AD and hasn't stopped since, I guess is the way to put it. and so, the first instincts, which were probably natural instincts in our species, was to, either, my way or the highway, discern and pull out, and certainly the Catholic Church until very recently, had the Inquisition, and if you didn't agree with them, they'd burn you at the stake. Uh, so where's the Christianity in that? But
I'll share, if I could, I'll just share on page 248 of Memory Streams and Reflections. One of the things I wrote down was, I might be, maybe you've already read this, I don't know, but I asked him, Ochiwe Biano, why he thought the whites were all mad. His response, they say that they think with their heads, he replied.
Right.
And then Jung said, well, why, of course, what do you think with? And Ochiwe Biano replied, we think here, he said, indicating his heart. And Jung said, I then realized on what the dignity, the tranquil composure of the individual Indian was founded. It springs from his being a son of the sun, S-U-N. His life is cosmologically meaningful, for he helps the Father and preserver of all life in his daily rise and descent. Talking about the sun, the preserver of all life. Right. If we set against this our own self-justification, the meaning of our lives as it is formulated by our reason, we cannot help but see our poverty. Out of sheer envy, we are obliged to smile at the Indian's naivete and to plume ourselves on our cleverness, for otherwise we would discover how impoverished and down at the heels we are. Knowledge doesn't enrich us, it removes us more and more from the mythic world in which we were once at home by right of birth.
Right. And what came out of the video today with Paul Vanderklee and the other two ministers was he was talking about Jordan Peterson and saying that he thought that Jordan Peterson was giving young men meaning to their lives. And of course, that's the poverty that in our modern society, we don't have a meaning that comes from our tradition anymore. I mean, unless we learn it, if we learn it and start to connect with it, maybe through Jordan Peterson, and obviously the reason that there are libraries full of theological books is because theologians have been connecting people up with this since forever. And, the Buddhists do the same thing. They have piles of books that talk about how you get to enlightenment, but enlightenment isn't in those books. Enlightenment is on the other side of the equation, on the Eros side. And so you can talk people up to a certain level. You can read the book, you can read the Bible every year for 50 years and never grok it unless you can cross over to the other side, because as long as it's logos, it's just a skeleton. It's like looking at a skeleton, or looking at a ladder, Jacob's ladder.
Yeah, and I don't think, honestly, in the Bible, I don't find any statement insofar as the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus that we have any right to disrespect their creation stories or trample over them, such as we have.
Absolutely.
We're starting to come around to appreciate them.
Starting to. So, Marcus, the only thing I can say to you is don't let this become something between you and your sister. you know, I have a similar problem because, you know, I have a daughter who did say that to me, and um, who's a very devout Christian, who has her four of my grandsons, in a Christian school. And, you know, what Dr. Jung believed is you're blessed if you have the charisma of belief. That's what he said. And so if you believe and that's fine for you, then go for that. And, you know, I have no right to come in between my daughter and her church, or my daughter and her children, or her children and their church. Now, and I certainly wouldn't while they're under 18 in any case, but because their upbringing is their parents' reserve, and I wouldn't try to interfere. But at the same token, I know what kind of world we live in. And as much as a mother and a father, in this case, want to protect their children from other ways of thinking, you know, once they go out into the world, once they go to college, you know, okay, they might go to a Christian college, but you can't protect them from everything forever. You know, they're going to have to live their lives. And, you know, I know sure as shooting that one or two of these young boys are going to end up having issues about the rationality of the church and the rational truth of the church. And, you know, that's when I'm standing by with a safety net to help them.
There is a movement now called deconstructing, and it's because a number of evangelicals can't accept anymore certain of the beliefs of their particular denomination. For instance, when it comes to the LBT, I apologize.
LGBT.
Yeah,
Yeah.
LGBT, and there are more letters.
Yeah.
They just don't buy into that now. So they're looking for where do they go from here? They've been in this one camp, but
Yeah,
they
there's
can't
no-
be there anymore, and they don't know what camp to go into, but they are struggling with it. They are talking about it. There are videos and groups and so forth, and the word deconstruction, they're deconstructing that strict evangelical line.
Yeah.
And haven't yet found quite where they want to land.
And unfortunately, all the Plymouths have been colonized at this point. I mean, that's exactly the same issue that the Puritans went through. Okay, because the Puritans, when the when Henry VIII wanted to marry other women, and he got himself out of the Catholic Church, the Puritans decided that they could go over to Holland, to Netherlands, and practice their faith purely, and that the Dutch wouldn't bother them. And they were right, except that after 10 years, they figured out that the Dutch were too liberal. And so they got back on their ships and went to Plymouth. And that's the source of our Puritanism to this day. But the problem that they have now is that there are no more Plymouths. There's no place on the world that you can get away from these things. And so, you know, these different types of religion that are very rigidly organized are going to have to rethink themselves, because the world has changed. And, you know, you can't keep your children from watching television and internet forever. You know, even if you could do it until you die, ultimately they're going to have the freedom to go out and find the rest of the world. And, you know, so therefore the culture pots are all full of holes, and we have to figure out how we're going to live going forward. I mean, it used to be you could have your culture pot and everybody would believe the same thing and everything was hunky dory, but you know, that went down with Humpty Dumpty. and, and and it's not going to be put back together again because we can't even live without the internet anymore.
Yeah, Paul Vanderklay did a video recently, and he was showing a guy that did a video or a movie on young, what they call nuns, which is no religious denomination stated,
Right.
and how the percentage is going up.
Hmm.
And they talked to young kids and adults
Yeah.
about what they thought about it. And it was amazing in terms that they addressed the LGBTQ thing, but they have learned because of the internet and because of the information that they get, the jig's up, folks. I
Yeah.
mean, they understand what religion has done, the history of it, what it's the tragedies that are involved. The young kids, because of this information that we can get, it's at your fingertips.
Hmm.
So I mean, they know what's going on, so they know that, hey, I don't want to join that. And Paul
Sure.
keeps saying that, well, he thinks the church has been doing this for years and counseling people and blah blah blah. And he said, I know when they get older, they'll come to a life, and when they start thinking about dying, that all of a sudden they're going to come back to the church, and as a lot of older people do when they get toward the end stage of life, trying to find some sort of relief.
Right.
So this is the argument that, and it's what Nancy was saying. They are looking at this, the churches, but they really need to get on the stick, because Jordan Peterson is bringing people back to some of the churches, but then the people get there and they go, what? You know, they haven't changed. So
Yeah. So Nicholas says maybe the West-West rift. I think you might mean the East-West rift, but anyway, West-West rift also has to be united. Well, surely it does, but it's not going to be done by anybody organizing it. It has to be done organically, and um, you know, this is why Jung didn't try to get into correcting any religions, because you can't correct them. They're going to self-correct, because because the young people see that the jig's up, and their parents are going to die off, and they're going to have a different attitude, and the next generation will, and the next generation will, and there's just no stopping it.
well, Paul brought up that some of those nuns are more intuitive. And
Yeah.
so they're more eros oriented in the first place.
Hmm.
Art said, do you think that it is the shadow?
Yeah, it is the shadow, but I mean, in order to teach that depth of shadow, we have to go far afield. Yes, it is the shadow, and all the discernments and slicing and dicing of all the religions represent the shadow in various cultures, and in Japan. It's very common for people to be Shinto when they're young, and most people get married Shinto, and then they might be Catholic during their middle age, but everybody comes back to Buddhism in the end, because Buddhism has the best technology, it seems, for dealing with death, and so in Buddhism, one is always thinking about death, believe it or not. And of course, the Catholics did this for centuries, um, where the priests and monks would go wake up every morning and say "Memento Mori" to one another, remember death. And so, let's see, I do want to get into the life after death thing, but not quite yet.
There is something I would like us to look at on page 256
Okay.
before we change here.
Okay.
And I had forgotten that this had been written. It's in the first paragraph at the top, of, a little below the midway.
Mm-hmm.
And Jung is speaking. I envied him for the fullness of meaning in that belief, and had been looking about without hope for a myth of our own. Now I knew what it was, and knew even more that man is indispensable for the completion of creation, that in fact he himself is the second creator of the world, who alone has given to the world its objective existence, without which, unheard, unseen, silently eating, giving birth, dying, heads nodding through hundreds of millions of years, it would have gone on in the profoundest night of non-being, down to its unknown end. Human consciousness created objective existence and meaning, and man found his indispensable place in the great process of being.
Right.
We don't hear a lot about that.
Right. And we actually have to go earlier in that one, because it wasn't actually about the Pueblos. It was about his trip to the Algani of Kenya. And he was out in the Pampas, or, this great plain near Mount Agani, and he was able to split off from his friends and climb up on the mountain, and he got to a point where he could look out over this huge plain and see these rivers of species, all these species rolling back and forth as they had done for hundreds of millions of years. And so then that's when he thought back on his friend at the Pueblo, and realized that man is the consciousness of God. We're not only in God's image, but we're God's eyes and ears, basically, because we have consciousness about it. And so it puts humanity in a unique location in the greater scheme of things. That was his point. And so that was the other point that I too wanted to make about the travel section. Thank you, Nancy, for reminding us to get back to that. Did you have any thought about that further, Nancy, since you raised it?
I just noticed Jerome has his mic on. Maybe he wants to say something.
Okay, go for it.
Oh, I was just going to, I related that to Jung's answer to Job, where he realized that man has to participate in the consciousness, and that he felt that that's how we advance it, is by our participation in it. So,
right.
Yeah, and I feel that the business as usual Christianity that is in all these churches, it puts a damper on people being, to individuate and to participate, as you said, Jerome, and to, be the consciousness of God, to be the consciousness, carry on the consciousness of Jesus. I just think that when they just say, oh, you want to, you're going to be lost if you don't come over and, join our congregation, and basically, as I've said in the past, kind of tell you to just sit in the pews, in the rows, listen to the person, typically a guy at the front of the room, on the pulpit and at the lectern, and check your heart, brain, and soul at the door.
Yeah. So, Miles, you have a shout out from a fellow Albertan here in in the YouTube chat. Marcus says, will the new technological age aid in the destruction of established religion and promote a culture of internet entertainment consumption? I would say that the technological age is going to vastly change religions over time, but I think that they will become more more internalized because people will understand them better. Because people have been in all these silos for thousands of years now, and you know, if we include Judaism, we can go back 3,500 years easily, and so there are all these silos that people have been raised in, and those silos are now full of holes. So they can't. They have to interact. Okay, they just don't have any choice, and how quickly that will happen and get deeper. I mean, Dr. Jung was talking about a new stage of consciousness, a step above, where we actually go back to the religions, because the religions have the organically, evolutionarily developed method of mental health. Okay, that's what they provided. And Dr. Jung observed that. And you can't, you can't just cut it off and think that you're going to be able to build something artificially. Okay, this is where I started to get angry with Vervaeke, because he was thinking he could create a Wikipedia page and let everybody put in a piece of their religion and create a religion artificially. It doesn't work that way. That's like saying that you're going to take an artificial arm and replace your real arm with it. It just isn't going to work that way. I mean, it might work some function, but the new religion that will evolve and is constantly evolving, but is going to evolve differently, is going to evolve vastly differently than anything Dr. Jung ever imagined, because he died in 1961 and UNIVAC wasn't even known by very many people by 1961. Okay, so there were a few people that knew about computers in 61, but not many. And even Bill Gates couldn't imagine that anybody would ever need to make a computer file bigger than 640 kilobytes. Originally, I mean, that was Bill Gates' original thought back in 1980. And so things have been changing so fast, and I feel like I've had to reinvent myself every month since about 1980. I think a lot of people do feel that way, that are old enough to remember that far back. You're reinventing yourself, right, Nancy?
Every day.
Yeah, every day. That's what I thought. Okay. Marcus says, I can say personally from the newer generation, I have to leave my technology at home for the majority of the day, or else it will consume me. Yes. Nicholas says, no, I meant west-west, meaning between church and Jung. And in response to Marcus's comment about Jung being banned from mention in front of the kids, well, they can't keep it out anymore. I mean, I've created almost 1,100 videos on this channel, and it's been viewed in over 100 countries, and even if you chopped off the internet tomorrow, there have been seeds planted around the world that can't be stopped. And Jung I'm convinced that Jungian psychology is actually part of the solution for religions, not the enemy. Okay, because it first recognizes the way our minds really work, our psyche really works, and then puts all the religions in context, which, you know, for what it's worth.
Yeah, you have to look at it through a Jungian lens. In
Yeah,
other
I mean,
words, that
600 years.
yeah, that gives you the context, and so you can see, oh my gosh, look what, and you know, I hate to get back to the shadow, but as Art was pointing out, but we project this on these other groups, our own shadow, and
Absolutely.
we think that group is bad, where we're just projecting that something that's bad in ourselves that we hadn't dealt with, and so we need to figure out how to contact and resolve that, but we have to know that we need to do it, you know. So
Oh yeah.
most people aren't aware. They'll say, well, I don't have a shadow, you know. But
Yeah, right. Okay. So we had an interim chapter in here, which is on visions. Did I can talk through a couple things about this very quickly, but if any of you have any comments about the visions that are in this particular chapter, you want to bring them up, and then we'll move on to the afterlife. Okay, well, I'll start talking about it anyway. So this chapter is mainly about Dr. Jung's heart attack period in 1944. He had a heart attack. And during his convalescence, he had a series of visions. And one of them took him to a temple that was actually floating in the air. And first he found himself floating about 1,000 miles over Sri Lanka and, and looking at the world as a globe. So this was before any of us had seen the Earthrise photograph that Frank Borman took in 1968. And so, you know, people hadn't really focused on the fact that, you know, we're really living on this sphere out here in endless space. and so he was seeing that, and then there was a temple there, and he goes into the temple and he finds an adept who's meditating, and he realizes that this adept has his face, and he has the idea that if that adept were to come out of his meditation, that he would die. He had that insight, and he had a tremendous feeling of kind of euphoria, like it was like a near-death experience for him. And when he was coming out of it, he saw his doctor sort of emerging in his dream, and he says, oh no, I'm going to have to go back to that world of boxes, which is very interesting. So he was seeing the world as, you're in your box, I'm in my box, and he really didn't want to be in the world of boxes anymore, which is what obviously the rational world has done to us. It put us all in our little boxes. And so he came out of his vision, but the doctor died that day, amazingly. The day that Dr. Jung realized that he was going to have to come back into life, the doctor himself died in his place, and is what his perspective of it was. And that happened, in fact, which is really quite something. So any thoughts about that? And it's an interesting vision, and it was an interesting near death experience. But you know, and there's more in Travels to be read and understood. That's interesting. But
Well, he did talk about I think in the visions part that you're reading,
yeah.
it talked about the doctor recognized, or the nurse recognized that he had a certain aura about him.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
And that I have an uncle who's a minister, and he sees a lot of people on their deathbeds, and he talks to a lot of nurses and doctors.
Right.
And you can tell patients they'll start emitting that particular aura, and it's almost disquieting when they walk into the room. It's almost like grace is how they describe it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but then they have other people that don't. So, you know.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of people do, though, and my wife Debbie is a vigil volunteer for hospice. So that what that means is that she goes and sits with the dying to comfort them, and she does that as a volunteer. She doesn't do that as an employee. She's also an employee of the hospice, but she volunteers her time in the evenings to sit with them, and you know, she has all kinds of experiences like that. So those things are real, and you know, I think we just don't know enough about them at this point in time. And our rational science way of thinking about things, you know, science decides what science is going to put on the table so we can consider, and they haven't allowed onto the table the consideration of these sorts of events. And you know, there's probably 1,000 PhD theses waiting to be written about such things.
Yeah, and the scientists would just deny it. They don't believe in that. So.
Yeah, and of course they very often miss the mark, right?
That's correct. That's right. Like I said, each of us can miss the mark. Just
right.
let's get together and figure out what the mark is.
Right, because I mean, crazy thing is, here's a story for you. I learned from a reliable source, I'm not going to say who, that about half the spacecraft that we've sent to Mars have failed. And one example was, and they, you know, had to research why it failed, and the reason was that part of the spacecraft was built with metric, and part of the spacecraft was built with English measurements. And so at the crucial moment, that particular spacecraft didn't function properly because they used the wrong metric, and it crashed into the dark side of Mars. and so the scientists aren't everything they're all cracked up to be. I mean, statistics, you know, the shocking thing to me, and the wake up call for me, was that I went to this MBA program that was 15 courses in statistics by different names. So man, I was out there in the rational world, rationale and everything. Got my MBA and went to Japan to run a company. And after I got my diploma from the MBA program, I never once ran a regression analysis, not once, because in small business, you never have enough data points to make it meaningful. And so, you know, all that statistics is really great if you're going to work with the census or something like that. But if you're in small business, man, you better learn seat of the pants. So anyway, so Miles says he's been called away. And so anyway, let me go over to the chats for a moment. Anything else?
I just wanted to say, Art sent us a message. Let's see. Sorry, I have to go now. Talk with you all soon. Have a good night.
Yeah, okay, great. And okay. So Penelope says she sees faces each night, and I know they are from other realms. And I think I mentioned once before that when I had my knee replaced at about midnight that night, I was, on some sort of drug, but, I had a vision of this ball that was floating next to my bed, and it was filled with people. I mean, the souls of people. I mean, it was a sphere, and I don't know, there were a lot of people there, at least 10 and maybe as many as 100. And so you never know. And Marcus says, is there a sense of benevolence that is associated with a near-death experience? I think that may be true, although I think that depends on what your life has been like a bit. And Penelope says, I also have OBEs and visit people and places at times. I don't doubt it. Okay, so are we ready to go on to after life, after death, life after death, on life after death? What I took from this is that Dr. Jung wanted to be cagey about what life after death was about. But basically, he said that, you should have a view about it, because it will be enriching if you do it, and if you just deny it, then you're not going to have a very comforting death, certainly. And if you can find a way to think about life after death, then you can be more equanimous, I guess, when the time comes for you, I guess is what he would say. But you have any thoughts about that, Jerome or Nancy?
Well, I'd say we should just be humble and say we don't know, or I don't know. I've had experiences of where I could see, into the future and fly around in different realms and so forth. But I don't know. So I'm just going to say it. So you admit that you don't know.
Well, but you can have a perspective. And I think that Dr. Jung would rather say that it's more healthful from a psychological point of view if you have a perspective about it. And if you actually envision something, that the psyche is designed to help you with that, maybe. And what I think he did from his own perspective was he did all his writing because he knew he was going to live on after his death through his writing. He knew what he'd done. He knew what he had done in his writing, and the reason he agreed to the BBC interview and to doing Man and His Symbols for the layman, and also probably Memories, Dreams, Reflections, was that he wanted to make it more accessible for the layman, because what has happened is that the Jungian analyst community has really hidden his work, within the context of their practices. I mean, they use these Jung societies around the world as sort of intakes for people that can afford $150 an hour for analysis. but but they haven't really promoted his work outside of that sort of a context. So what you get if you go to the Jung Society of Washington or something like that is somebody will tell a nice myth and then tell you about what it means, and hopefully enough people have come so that one or two of those will chat with the analyst afterward and maybe get into a relationship of an analysis. But I don't see it going much farther than that, with the exception of people like Jean Shinoda Bolen and Clarissa Pinkola Estes. But even they, have a limited audience. And
I wanted to mention on page 314 an interesting statement by Jung. He's talking about this is just a little above the halfway point. At one moment of death was being represented from the point of view of the ego, and the next from that of the psyche. And my own experience is that when facing my own death in May of 2018, I developed a trembling that I still have. That was the ego, the body, facing the reality of the end of everything I know and everything I love. But then as I have progressed in my spiritual life, I'm now in touch with the eternal in me and beyond me. So there's a sense in which at my death, I'll be going to what I know. It's more of an intuition, I guess you could say. But there is a sense of continuation. And I think Jung mentions that too, that the psyche has a natural sense that we continue in some way.
Yeah. And I certainly think that that's true. I think part of my motivation for doing this YouTube channel is exactly that. It's been in a very ego-oriented sense, in the sense that because my grandchildren are all still under 18, I haven't felt very free to talk with them about these types of issues. But by leaving behind these videos, even if, I succumb to coronavirus in 3 weeks, which could happen, they will be able to get a sense of me. And what I very much regret is that the only thing that I have of my maternal grandfather is his gold watch that he got after 50 years on the Pennsylvania Railway, and my grandmother's engagement ring, which I gave to one of my daughters. On his side, on my paternal grandfather's side, I have a tie tack. That's it. And so that's what I would love to be able to talk to my grandparents or my great grandparents about some of these issues. It would be fascinating because their way of looking at the world was very different from what we have. I'll just give you an example here, because I happen to have this one picture of my great grandmother, and you'll get a sense of it, I think. Okay, so I think oops, did I get it? No, somehow I missed it. Just a second. Okay, here it is. All right, so this is my great-grandmother and my great-great-grandfather. So this woman on the left, this very solid woman, is Louisa Dockstader, and she was my great-great-grandmother. or my great-grandmother. And this is her father, Joseph, and he was my great-great-grandfather. And I actually knew, I never knew her, but I did meet this woman once. These are her sisters. I met this woman once. She had gone to Michigan, but I'd met her in Michigan. And these two ladies, Aunt Carrie and Aunt Ag, I knew for about 10 years because we would visit them in the summer times when they were approaching 100 years old, these ladies. But you see that they're all dressed in black, full length sleeves and full length dresses. And he, he looks like a Puritan kind of guy. And the original photograph of this, on the back of it, it says 1879 that this photograph was taken.
Boy, that's some beard he's got. Look
Yeah.
at that.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean,
Must have been the fashion back then.
Yeah, stolid old Dutch Calvinists, I'll tell you, that's what they were. Just like Paul Vanderklay. I mean, he's got a beard like Paul does.
Yeah, well, that's must be in the tribe.
Right. So, anyway, okay. So, Val, there's some interesting things coming out here. Penelope says, I've had a large floating eyeball in my room. Also, scarabs on my wall, the size of my hand. Yep. Those things come up just like for Dr. Jung. I don't know what she said, what you said, Jerome, where she said, good to hear that. Then Marcus says, is it really helpful to envision something, or could Nietzsche's idea that envisioning something after death is just a crutch for us to avoid the realities of the universe? Well, Nietzsche was quite the rationalist, so for him it would have been a crutch. But I think that if you're a rationalist, you ought to maybe cultivate the eros a little bit. And okay, so now this person, Valis, says, I am John the Baptist or Elijah. Hagia Sophia is dueling the devil to get me out of his hell. This is Jacob Rothschild's Hell Computer Matrix. Okay, well, Hagia Sophia is quite a place, as you might know. This is a cathedral in Istanbul, which was built 1,000 years before St. Peter's. And so it was built about 550 roughly AD. And for 1,000 years, it had the largest dome in the world. And it wasn't until St. Peter's was built in the 15th century that a larger dome existed. But up until then, it was the largest dome in the world. And I visited it once, and it's just fascinating because of how they built it. And remember that the average cathedral in Europe took 100 years to build, and therefore 3 or 4 generations to build. The Hagia Sophia was built in 5 years, and at a time long before there was mechanization. And can you guess how they built the dome? Jerome, my engineer friends. Miles, you're an engineer. How did they build the dome in 550 AD?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I think a lot of them mostly had massive wooden scaffolding.
Okay, this is built from stone, though. So
well, you do have to have scaffolding to, like in an arch, you have to have the scaffolding underneath first to hold it up.
Yeah.
And then you take the scaffolding out. and then it's freestanding once you put the keystone in.
Well, it's something like that, Jerome. But what they did was they simply built up dirt all the way up to the top inside the building. They filled it up with dirt,
Yeah, that's
making
brilliant.
them
Yeah,
making themselves higher and higher and higher. And okay, they may have created sort of a scaffolding out of dirt.
the dirt was the scaffold, and then they dug the dirt out. Oh,
Right.
that's brilliant, brilliant.
Yeah, and then they dug the dirt out, and so really a special thing. Later, it was turned into a mosque. It's right across the street from the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. So if you see a picture of Istanbul, very often you'll see the Blue Mosque in the image, because it's right over the Bosphorus. But the Hagia Sophia is right there also, so you can see the dome. And the dome is red as opposed to the dome on the mosque being blue, I think. But, well, it's the Blue Mosque, so yes. Anyway.
But I think that's incredible, the way that you combine the aesthetics and the engineering together as they meet. And I want to go back to something Nancy said. Nancy said that she was in touch with this, what did you say? You were in touch with the force, or what do you call it?
The eternal.
Right, the eternal. And when you get in touch with that, that's what you're being fed by to create these things. And that is meaning. That's what Jung called meaning in itself. And until you do that, you're not going to get that much meaning. But you get meaning from being connected and in the flow. And so you're kind of going, you connect with that, but you also can manifest itself as a bridge, engineering, technical. It could be anything. Piece of art, use. So.
Yeah. And so one of the other things that Dr. Jung talked about in here was karma. And, I know that karma works. I don't have to believe, I know. Because what go in the West, it's what goes around comes around. Okay, people get their just desserts. It might not come back in your lifetime so that you would see it, but I've in my lifetime had so many experiences where people have done negative things to me, and I never have to get angry about it, because I know that karma will get them, and invariably it works 100% as far as I'm concerned. And so I don't know, do you have experiences with karma? No. I would have thought Miles might have had some experience with karma.
Well, I have my suspicions, and I sometimes think of situations where I was wronged, and I think, I won't confront the person or bring it up, because I know they've had great suffering, and I'm not necessarily attributing it to karma, but you sort of just have to wonder a little bit, because you think, well, you were wronged, but then you see what's happened to somebody else, what's happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
And you just have nothing but sort of sadness for them, because relatively speaking, what happened to me was nothing nearly as significant or tragic.
So Penelope says, go ahead.
I was just going to share a little bit more, so sort of along what Nancy was saying about her encounter with her mortality and the insights that gave her, and linking it back to the Native American thought. I had the pleasure one day to find out that this gentleman that I very much appreciate was giving a talk. His name is Dr. Leroy Little Bear, and he's a professor of Native American Studies here in Alberta, founder of actually the first courses in that area of study. And he describes the Blackfoot metaphysics, as he called it. His presentation was Blackfoot metaphysics in waiting. So in other words, they're waiting for us to come around to their way of thinking, rather sooner rather than later. And he says that, Western thought is future oriented instead of their thought is now oriented. And, you've talked about the eternal now, the eternal moment. So they're very much in line with that. Western thought is focused on time, whereas Native thought is focused on place. And, to think that if we weren't so focused on time and we were more focused on place, we'd be probably a lot more relaxed about death, because we would be just thinking of it. If I'm thinking they may see it as just, well, you're going to be going from one place to another place. And, it's sort of interesting to wonder how you would feel if we didn't have all these clocks and weren't so always fixated about what time it is and when do we have to do this or do that. And he says our Western metaphysics are all about the values of bigger, newer, faster, higher, more, and such. And even, our Western thought about health is measured in numbers. We worry about our numbers. Go get your blood tested, and holy cow, the variations of different measurements they can make.
Yeah, you get all the statistics. They don't tell you about the black swans, though.
Yeah. And then the weather as well. Weather. We talk about, well, what's the temperature going to be? How many degrees Fahrenheit or Celsius? Whereas they would have had perhaps all sorts of visual descriptions, I would think.
Yeah, they would look up at the sky and tell you what the weather was, or feel how humid it was at 2 a.m. and tell you what kind of a day it was going to be.
Yeah, with some sorts of descriptions.
I wonder what they would say about daylight savings time. Like, I'm saving
American.
Am I saving daylight? Where?
Right. Something like what American farmers think about.
We're saving daylight. Oh.
Who's going to tell the cows when they're going to want to be milked, right? Yeah.
You're right. The cows don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, but they still have to be milked at the same time. It's just a different time for us, but not for them. So, obviously Buddhism and other religions talk about reincarnation, and I certainly think myself, because Penelope says, what about past life karma? And I think we have a lot of that. I mean, I because I happen to know something about my family history, I can put myself in the environments in which a lot of my ancestors lived, including the Dizzy Dockstader girls there, and the Dockstader girls don't look so much different from what Saudi women look like today, for example. When they're wearing their abayas, and we aren't that far removed from that time. Certainly not from a cultural point of view. And I know that Saudi women feel protected by their abaya, and they, there's this cartoon where the Saudi women are looking at the American women in bikinis on the beach and say, "Oh, I feel so sorry for them," and the American women on the beach are thinking, "Oh, I feel so sorry for them," about the Saudi women and their abayas. And it's just a different point of view. But I certainly have had incidents where I've had visitations. Certainly, ghosts have approached me. My brother, for example, and I know that that's a psychic emanation, but it's still my brother in the sense that he still lives in me. And I know that my relationship with my parents hasn't changed significantly for 50 years. I mean, yes, they're not here anymore from a physical point of view, but in terms of how I feel about them and how I think about them, not changed by the fact that they're dead. So in that sense, they certainly still live. And, as I said, I don't know how long YouTube will leave these videos here, but, I'm hopeful that they leave them long enough for my grandchildren to experience them. And, in any case, what we do reaches out into the world. And so we currently have almost 20 people involved in this conversation. And every one of them in some little ripple is touched by what we say today. And it's something that can never leave them, even if they want it to, right? It's always going to be there at some level. And, anyway, so, I think
I'll just add something. I earlier talked about Joanna Macy and her book, Active Hope. And it's also co-authored by somebody named Chris Johnstone. And it's in this book that she describes power over versus power with. And I think that's a great concept.
Yeah. And Robert says, eternal recording. Montana says, I had a strange OBE the other night. Right before I had the OBE, I seen a woman in a gown hovering above my house, twirling a rope in a slow downward spiral. Next thing I know, I was sucked through this, sucked through the roof of my house. Interesting. We can have all kinds of experiences like that. Penelope says, like, if I pass, I have someone allocated to my Facebook, and guess as long as someone can change account information, they could be up forever. They could keep it up forever.
Yeah, that's true. I've heard,
Yeah.
People need to think about what will they do with their social media accounts and include that in their estate or will planning. It's a good point.
I think of things like there's a movie called Eternal Beloved, and it's about Beethoven, and he wrote this symphony for someone he was in love with. I think he couldn't consummate it for some reason. But in any case, it was the Ninth Symphony, and he couldn't hear it. But anyway, he could write it and actually perform it as the conductor, and that's sort of the story of this movie. But the point is that all of his symphonies are immortal, as are those of many others, and all the great novels are eternal, and the spirits of those individuals live on forever, or for a very long time, and they'll be affecting, even if they were totally destroyed tomorrow. If you had read their novel, it's still continuing on in you in some way, in an archetypal sense. And Robert says, what's your take on the black books? Well, the black books were the raw material for Jung's red books. So, for example, I've kept books like this forever, okay, for the last 30 years. And I finally threw a lot of them away when I moved into an apartment. I had boxes of them, literally. And I finally decided that they should be immortal as parts of my individuation, but they didn't need to burden my children with them, and so I threw them away. But nonetheless, we all affect one another in one way or another, and so that life force that spiritual life force that we pass out from ourselves, all of us, is a kind of immortality. Obviously, some people are more immortal than others. Obviously, the Buddha and Jesus Christ are immortal, and no one could deny that. But so is Alexander Solzhenitsyn and many other people who've done incredible things. And so Dr. Jung was very adamant that one should live this life, that you shouldn't postpone your life for the heavenly realm, because, oh, by the way, you might be disappointed. But, if you leave your spirit here on earth in some sort of form, whether it's tangible or in little green electrons, that is a kind of immortality, isn't it? Because who can deny that both Carl Jung and Jesus Christ and the Buddha has been in this conversation in the last 1 minute, right? They have been, clearly. And probably long after I'm gone, Miles will be taking my name in vain, I suppose. No.
Is he the youngest?
I think he's the youngest, maybe.
Well, I
Maybe.
do. My wife is after me to stop taking notes, because I take a lot of notes. I have numerous binders, such as this one.
Uh-huh.
And this is actually a section that's dedicated to the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group, and quotes of you here, Skip, and others, but mostly Skip. So his influence is even in ink in my basement. So
okay,
it
so
gets
here,
around.
But I take notes, Miles. I take notes like that and throw them away. But when I take notes, this is how I remember stuff.
Yeah, but
It helps my memory to write it. When
yeah,
I read it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
And you can go back and you can refresh your memory, and the repetition is important. In fact, that's what Dr. Leroy Littlebear said is one of the things that differentiates Native American education, traditional education, a lot of repetition. He tells a story of how when he was a boy, he was in one of the residential schools, and it was essentially this instructor, his teacher was saying, so what's the capital of Canada, to his little friend, and his little friend knew the answer but purposefully wouldn't say the correct answer, and somehow through some sort of sign language, all the little kids in that classroom purposefully would not answer the question correctly. But we have in our education system, he said, the Western education is the expectation that you go through grade 3, and when you're in grade 5, the teacher will be very angry if the teacher has to remind the child of something they learned in grade 3. Whereas, again, their approach to education is you repeat things all the time. They don't chunk it out and think that you have to take a kid and move them through this machine of education and cookie cutter, one size fits all type approach. So anyway, taking notes is a very important manual exercise for me, and also by having them to quickly jump back to it refreshes.
Right. So to finish up on the answer here for the chat, the black books were Dr. Jung's version.
Tim Holmes is trying to get on.
Oh,
He's
sorry.
Locked out. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, I cannot find him that way. He left, it seems. Okay. All right. So going back, I'll watch for it now.
Okay.
Because it'll come up on the chat or on the participants, but he's not showing us in the attendees at the moment. The black books were Dr. Jung's version of my note-taking. That's why I was talking about my note-taking. And his black books are to be published this year, I understand. So it'll be an interesting publication to be looking for, because Sonu Shamdasani said that he left about 50% out of the available material for the Red Book. And so there's a lot more Red Book style material that's there. Yeah, so Tim, if you just try again, we'll watch for you. So someone wanted, okay, so Rocket King said, open question, what are the primary blocks on a person's ability to have mystic experiences, visions, and dreams? You want to tackle that one, Jerome?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, what are the primary blocks on a person's ability to have mystic experiences, visions, and dreams?
Mystic. Okay. Well, I think most people dream.
Yeah, sure.
And I think mystic experiences would be in terms of it being a numinous type event. I would call that a mystic experience, and that is when you. There's several ways you could do it. One is just to relax and meditate, and you get down into what's called a lower level of what do you call that? The nuvu. There's a name for it. Mental nuvu or something like that.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of it, but from.
Tim says still not working. I'm not seeing you come up here, Tim. I'm sorry.
I don't see him there either. It's kind of a hard question because you need to know the definition of mystical experience. And what is it? And,
well, you have to recognize it as such, as a numinous experience, as a synchronicity. And if you are totally logicized, okay, if you think you're totally rational, then chances are it might be hard. You have to open yourself to the possibility that something can happen. And
yeah, it's like I've heard people say, like, I can't be hypnotized.
Anybody that follows this channel knows I can be hypnotized because I do it in the middle of readings. I don't even, this last reading I did in the Red Book, which was like the fourth reading in the Magician piece, man, I was hypnotizing myself 2 or 3 times. I just went out. And
but it wasn't a mystical experience, was it?
Well, it was a painful experience because because here I'm reading along. I don't know what I've left out there online, but and I'm not sure you can tell that I was hypnotized. It might be that I just delayed like a fraction of a second too long or something. But for me, it was like Jean-Luc Picard in that one episode of Star Trek where he gets hypnotized for 30 seconds and he lives 30 years in another world, right? Comes back with the flute. That's what it's like for me. And so, the issue is, I mean, in hypnotism, what happens is your conscious mind gets overwhelmed. And when we're talking about all these archetypal things, it's very easy to have your conscious mind overwhelmed. And so there are several cases of me just falling asleep in the middle of a reading because I just can't keep my eyes open. And so, Tim, I'm still not seeing you on this side. I hope you have the right link.
I don't see him on the panelist list here. So
right. And
but I also want to get back to this mystical experience thing because it's hard to explain and I can't get a handle on it for some reason. Because you can have numinous experiences, but they're not mystical experiences.
Yeah. Well,
people can take, for instance, a drug or something and think they're having a mystical experience, but it's just a bunch of neurons firing,
Yeah, it's random stuff.
Yeah, it's just there's no connection, in other words.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think mystical experiences is you're connected to the source. And maybe Nancy could. Is that kind of your experience? At least my experience is. I know I'm connected with the source.
Yes, that's my experience as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I would call that a mystical experience or just an experience of the self or God or whatever you want to call it.
Right. So Penelope's talking about out-of-body experiences, and she's being asked by another whether she knew whether she was having an out-of-body experience when she was 4. And I certainly remember having such experiences when I was young. But in terms of synchronicity, acausal, connecting principle type things, I have those things happen to me every day without fail. And it's just a question of recognizing them as understanding them. So think of them. You often have coincidences occur in your life, okay? And so what are the coincidences that come to mind, okay, that happened in your life? And the one that comes to my mind is there was this young woman who was a classmate of mine from high school from Japan. And the day I joined the Marine Corps, I'm sure I passed her on the stairway in Metro Airport in Detroit. And it was just a coincidence that she happened to be there. I never have seen her before or since then, but I remember that one moment, and it passed like that. And so that was a numinous experience for me. I mean, I've always wondered what happened to her, and none of my classmates know what happened to that young woman. I won't mention her name, but when I joined the Marines, let's see, it was 3 years after we graduated from high school, I guess. So I hadn't seen her for 3 years, and I haven't seen her since. But in that one instant, I saw her by coincidence. It was a coincidence on the stairway at Metro Airport, but it was a numinous experience. And just as we've been talking about this just now, it reminded me of that experience, of all the other ones that I've ever had. That's the one I think about, I thought of just now. And so everybody has coincidences in your life. Chances are the ones you remember are the numinous ones. Is what I would say. And so once you think back and think of some of the things that come to your mind when you think of what happened that was a coincidence in your lifetime, then you can start to recognize when these things are happening. And as I say, I see them every day. So, but I'm extremely intuitive. So, if you're a sensing person, it may not be so easy, but that's what happens to me. And Penelope says, I had one buying coffee tonight. Nicholas says, when Skip gets hypnotized, it's scary. Unconscious gets read as conscious, and horses become blue. It's like the red book becomes the orange book. Yeah, I suppose it might be like that. Anyway. Okay, anything else you want to talk about the afterlife? I mean, everybody needs an afterlife, is what I think what Dr. Jung is saying. And so you need to develop an attitude about it, that if you don't have such a attitude about it, then when you get to the end of your life, it's going to be tough. And, in Buddhism, Buddhism is talking about death every day. I mean, every teaching is about death in Buddhism because they're preparing you for that moment when you're facing the great mystery, and so I think that Dr. Jung thinks you need to prepare for facing that moment. And so you ought to have a belief about it. So I know that Debbie, when she's sitting with someone, based on what their belief system is, she tries to help them visualize something in their belief system. Like I know when my father was dying, she was helping him envision Christ and so on. And so I think it's good to have such a system that you can fall back on at the end of your life. And so if you haven't thought about it, it's probably a good idea to think about it from time to time. As I say, Buddhists think about it all the time, but medieval monks thought about it every day. When they greeted one another, they'd say "memento mori," which means remember death. Because you have to make the most of this life, and so death is pretty final and cold. from a bodily point of view. You know, after you die, maybe three days after you die, your body's going to be incinerated, and so it's not going to really mean much of anything. It's, you know, how you've made people feel and so on that's going to live on. You know, and so anyway, that's a little navel gazing for you. Anything else to say? Okay. Anyway, I recommend that you think about the afterlife. It's worth doing. And so next week, let's talk about late thoughts, which is chapter 12. We're still working with memories, dreams, reflections, so we can talk about anything else in this book. This is the book we're talking about, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And this is the memoir of Jung's development of his own psychic processes. And so the last chapter in the book is Late Thoughts. And so it's a pretty profound chapter in its own right. And that's the one. And so, you know, I urge you all to read it, and we can talk about it next week. Anything else? Yeah, the good thing is that we're all sterile here because I had to tell my meditation group that, you know, because they're having the great unwashed public coming into their offices, I can't meet with them until after we have a vaccine.
So we're safe on the internet for now. But,
yeah, so
I
far
guess
we haven't spread any diseases over the internet, as far as I know.
Yeah, we'll have our final thoughts next week then.
Yeah. On this, but I mean, I do believe the calculations that people have come up with that say, you know, this thing is going to double every 6 days, and you know, in Italy, between last Wednesday and today, it tripled, and so I think it would be very wise to be very careful and not assume that it's only old folks that you don't mind dying. I mean, that's basically what our president is saying. Well, it's only the old people that are going to die, and not necessarily realizing that he's in one of the at-risk groups. But you know, as I said, we're having this conversation because my grandfather was engaged to a woman who died with her 4 sisters on one weekend in 1918. And so it's a serious business. And the flu is a serious business too, obviously, but this looks like it's going to get much more serious very quickly. And obviously, we're not being told everything because, you know, the Prime Minister of Italy shut down Italy basically today. And I expect we're going to see a lot more of that in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and a lot of the airlines are grounding, especially their big jets, the big A380, that 4-engine double-decker plane. Lufthansa has grounded them. I think there was another airline because their load factor is only 38%. So, you know, 1/3 of a plane full of people is they can't afford it. And then, gosh, the cruise ships are pretty much docked, I guess, now. Because
yeah, they're going to have to change the names of all those cruise ships after they clean them, because who's going to go take a ride on the Crown Princess, right? Or the Diamond Princess, for that matter.
So yeah, we're probably just at the start of it. Who's to say just what all
Yeah.
the consequences in the next couple of weeks will be? But
Well, it's going to be a
hopefully,
lot
like
more
any,
than that. There's,
yeah,
because it's until we have a vaccine that's effective, it's going to be a problem. And so everybody should get ready. I mean, I remember when the crash of 2008 took place, and in September 15th, 2008 was when Lehman Brothers announced their bankruptcy. And within that week, somebody on LinkedIn gave the whole scenario of what would happen in the next 3 years. And he was absolutely right. And I don't want to be a scaremonger here, but I think these numbers are right and quite frightening. And if the healthcare system gets overwhelmed, then you may not have a problem with coronavirus because you're 20 years old and young, but you might have a problem with it if you can't get into the ICU if you have a motorcycle accident. So, these things can affect you in very serious ways. I mean, the conference I was going to in Switzerland has been canceled or postponed a year anyway. And so I urge everybody to take it seriously. We can have a lot of fun here on the internet without risking our lives. And so sorry, Tim, I just haven't been able to see you. Jerome, when Tim came on, was he on the Zoom connection? Were you seeing him there?
No, and I've been checking the show managed participants list, and he doesn't show up there either.
Yeah. Okay.
As there's only 4 panelists here, so
yeah. Okay, so let's wrap it up, and next week we will talk about late thoughts, and we'll wrap up our work on memory streams reflections, and then we'll have to think about where to go from there. I have a couple of ideas, but I welcome yours as well. So Tim tried Zoom several times. Okay, I don't have any idea why that didn't work, Tim. And let's see here. I guess the question is, and for anybody else that's looking at this, if you're interested in joining our panel, which means that your appearance is going to be public, and so your voice and image will be seen, but that is the link that we're using for this webinar every week. Is that the link you were using, Tim? I don't know. And hello, Nicole. Nice to see you too. Okay, so the Love Doctor is here, and some of you may not know who the Love Doctor is, but Nicole is a analyst, therapist, member of our advanced reading group who lives in Australia. And so we don't often get to connect with her because the time zones are so out of whack. Okay, all right. I'll talk to you, Tim. Okay, so we will see you next week. I'm going to end the meeting. See the advanced people on Wednesday at 1:30 U.S. Eastern Daylight Time. So see you then.